Hello. The question guiding today's episode of our series, Poetry and the Turning World, is what is the relationship between poetry and technology? How have the last century's rapid developments altered the poet's view of technology and their writing? Technically speaking, technology is more than simply machinery or even tools. The root of the word from the ancient Greek techne insists upon a practical application of craft or acquired skill. The returning hero Odysseus plugging his ears with wax to drown out the siren's song is as much a form of technology as T.S. Eliot's typist putting on a phonograph record to drown out a passionless tryst. Some would say technology solves all manner of problems, but possibly brings far more frightening ones. For example, much has and will no doubt continue to be written about the benefits and perils of artificial intelligence. Machine-made sentience has huge implications, including for the literary world, but more troublingly, much further afield. Technology and the climate crisis find themselves uttered in the same breath, and the same goes for warfare, for education, for even space exploration. But what does technology offer poets, and in turn, poetry in our current age of advancement and apprehension? My name is Sandeep Parmar, and I'm a poet, critic, and professor of English at Cornell University. And I am, as ever, talking to Sarah Howe, poet, critic, and poetry editor at Shadow and Windus. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Sandeep. We've chosen 3 poems today to help us navigate technology's intersections with poetry. But maybe it's worth thinking a little bit first about how poets have engaged with ideas of technology in the recent-ish past. I guess that all depends on how we're defining technology, though, and we could probably start anywhere, including with the pen that I'm holding in my hand right now as a talisman to make myself feel like I'm thinking. Last time we talked about Heaney's squat pen, snug as a gun, didn't we? But what difference does it make if poets are writing their poems with a pen or on a word processor or even in an app? I confess I don't keep a physical notebook anymore. If I have thoughts for poems to jot, I put them in the notes app on my phone. How about you?
It's so true, isn't it? I mean, I think that it's just so convenient because the phone is there as a sort of extension of one's body all of the time, sadly. I don't tend to write on my phone. I do know, though, that thinking about my own compositional process over the years, that certainly maybe, 2 decades ago when I used to write longhand, my poems had much longer lines. And I think now that I'm really just looking at the word processor all the time, or the laptop or however we're thinking about it, it's so kind of easy, isn't it, to be able to see the finished product as you compose your work. And my lines are probably very, very different now.
So the technology probably does make a difference to the texture of the poems, which is an argument that Hannah Sullivan, also a wonderful poet, made with her scholarly hat on when she suggested that maybe some of the innovations stylistically of the modernists were put downable to the typewriter, that suddenly seeing their drafts in typescript enabled them to be much more free and sweeping with their revisions, particularly excisions. If we think about Pound and Eliot's work on the typescript of the Wasteland, the typewriter is actually an important part of that story, maybe. But where does your mind go when you think about poetry and technology?
Well, actually, straight to the modernists, very much so, and not just the use of the typewriter, but in thinking about kind of typographies, and how sort of towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, we get this, this kind of expansion so much, this really radical change in the ways in which text can appear on the page. And in thinking about the modernists, the excitement of technology, I think about the futurists, specifically here the Italian futurists, who were really fascinated by speed and by technology and by warfare. And I'm thinking of F.T. Marinetti, who was the kind of founder of Italian futurism in 1909, his manifesto, in which he writes, time and space died yesterday. We already live in the absolute because we have created eternal, omnipresent speed. And the Italian Futurist Manifesto is kind of wonderful. It sort of begins with sort of boys in this car, and then they sort of overturn their car in a ditch. And then, whilst they're kind of decrying the end of sort of sentimentality and a break with the past, and this as an avant-garde kind of movement and sort of beginning of the way that we think about modernism sort of now, really does set a tone. And that tone is carried on by Ezra Pound and his sort of, his famous saying, make it new. What does that mean to make it new? And a lot of that really did depend on technology and was kind of focused around this sort of very quick rupture and the love of machines. Particularly for Marinetti, it was the car and the locomotive. And for others, it was sort of different things. I think about Nancy Cunard and her poems about the aerial bombing during the Spanish Civil War, which she was there for. And of course, famously with the bombing of Guernica, but the ways in which I think that was maybe the first example of aerial bombing, kind of used in a massive way, perhaps. But just the ways in which technology comes to sort of create this rupture of time, and a relationship then to time and space is completely kind of remade. And how beautiful that is and how worthy of celebrating that is for someone like Marinetti. Whereas in the case of Cunard, it's not necessarily a kind of celebratory, something to celebrate. But I also think of Hope Mirrlees' poem Paris, which is this beautiful, brilliant, long poem written in 1919, published by the Hogarth Press. And Mirrlees was writing this poem in Paris during the negotiation in the peace conference at the end of the First World War. And the poem really begins on an underground train. Where on the metro in Paris, and she's sort of descending, and then kind of goes through the city with all of these different sort of technological things sort of occurring around her. But there's also, I guess, typography there is an interesting way of trying to communicate distance and to communicate space and time. And we end up with the wonderful image of Freud dredging the Seine and waving his garbage in the glare of electricity. So again, technology is kind of really there to help us think about our relationship to the past and certainly the unconscious. But obviously there's the wasteland. There are many examples we can think of in which modernity comes to be defined as a relationship to technology.
And new technologies offer poets a palette of metaphors to think with, including maybe about their own ingenuity. I'm thinking about early modern developments in optics and the way that those lenses and telescopes and eventually microscopes offered Donne and the metaphysicals, say, this new way of thinking about these jarring conceits and ways of seeing the world through different lenses, effectively. I guess Donne and Milton both wrote about Galileo's telescope and seeing the moon or sunspots through it. And Milton famously met Galileo on a trip to Italy. In a more up-to-date instance of this, my mind leaps to Tracy K. Smith, former poet laureate of the US's wonderful book Life on Mars, and particularly her poem My God, It's Full of Stars, which is an elegy and a tribute to her father, who was an engineer who worked on the Hubble Space Telescope, bowing before its oracle eye, the poem puts it, during the Reagan years. But then the poem ends amazingly with this vision that has that sense of awe and wonder to it, like Keats's Watcher of the Skies and that Peak in Darien. We saw to the edge of all there is, so brutal and alive it seemed to comprehend us back. This sense that technology might mediate an encounter or even be the encounter with something beyond the human, more than the human. I think in the poems we'll look at today, there'll be lots of this configuring of time, as you said, into past and present, but also this idea of an edge, the cliff edge or the precipice that it feels like technology brings us to as humans, to peer beyond.
Yeah. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad, right? As we'll see, I think. Or sometimes it's both, I suppose, in some ways. And we can't really imagine what is over the edge until we get there. And how the poet meets that and how they respond to it is really fascinating, and how they make use of that technology.
Poets either love technology or they hate it, don't they?
Yeah, and I think that we even though we're not really looking at poets today who use technology in their writing, it must be said that there are many poets who create their poems or are generated by forms of technology. And, generally for us now, and particularly in kind of recent years, that would be through artificial intelligence or even just through the internet in some form or another. And I think this is where my own sense of technology slightly dissipates. But poets who know what they're doing would be people like Caroline Bergvall, the kind of British poet, J.R. Carpenter, who is a British-Canadian poet. And their work sort of qualifies as electronic literature. And it's, in a way, difficult to think about work that doesn't appear always in a book form. I mean, Bergvall and Carpenter do have poems that are in books, but a lot of the work in being generated by technology, I think Carpenter used, in fact, I think it was 93, she used Netscape to create poems. So some of this work exists in a kind of digital form. It's difficult to kind of be able to see how that then intersects with things that are written perhaps on the page or at least appear on the page. But that work also will veer on the kind of conceptual writing. So the repurposing or the kind of reconfiguration, mixing of existing texts into other texts. So, whether it's the kind of database of the New York Times being turned into a poem or whatever it is, poets like Christian Buck, I guess, would be really important in that discussion of how conceptual and digital work sort of make us really think about the possibilities that technology offers in repurposing and rethinking of language in a different context. And this is something that, is coming out of, I guess, sort of Dadaist thinking. What does art become or what can art be when we replace or repurpose the ordinary to some extent? And I have a really lovely example in mind of a poet who isn't sort of taking necessarily in quite the same direction as some of those other poets. But the poet Nasser Hussain, he was a British poet, British-Canadian, I should say. The Canadians really do, for some reason, become these forefront characters in digital literature. But he has a book called Skywritings, which came out fairly recently, where he uses IATA airport codes solely to write this book of poems. And this is a kind of example of kind of process-driven writing, but in fact is using a sort of technological tool to be able to reconstruct or rethink what language allows us to do. So the poem that I have here is called TMI, which I guess is too much information.
But it's also presumably some airport somewhere in the globe. I wonder which one that is.
I didn't look it up and I should have actually figured out where it was. But yes, all of these words I'm about to read are actually 3-letter words.
So Heathrow clever. Is what? LHR, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. And then sometimes there's confusingly a K at the beginning, but we're not going to worry about that. So TMI, the cop and the con and the CIA know all. Panopticons log our SMS, our sly sex, our naughtiness, etc. Got the decoder, God the gag orders, got the torturers. Hey, little spy, holes, peeper, get out. In the book, this poem actually comes straight after a poem called Islamophobia, which is a critique of U.S. nativism and the kind of Make America Great Again movement. And I think his work is really fascinating for us to think about how this technical shorthand effectively forms a sort of language that opens up questions about movement, again, through space and time. We're going to return to this frequently, I think, in our discussion, but also desire and love and proximities, and particularly kind of the spatiality and the spectrality of crossing those borders.
For me, I suppose that the sweet spot of this kind of procedurally generated work is when it does feel like it manages to surmount its constraints and say something meaningful about life now, as Nasser's poem very much does. It would be hard to talk about poetry and technology and the internet in particular without mentioning a movement called FLARF, which was sort of like the anarchic man-child wing, I suppose, of the serious artistry that you were introducing just now, Sandeep. So FLARF had its peak around maybe 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was a lot of discussion about how it would change poetry irrevocably forever, that the internet would make poetry unrecognizable within a decade or two. So it started as a prank, didn't it? This attempt to sort of undermine these amateur poetry contests that sites like poetry.com would run, probably still run. And I think it worked by using Google to harvest sort of weird juxtapositions and cliches and oddities from online forums. And the aim was positively to create poetry that was deliberately bad and, grammatically wrong, full of profanities. As one of its originators, Gary Sullivan, put it, they were aspiring for poems that were wrong, un-PC, out of control. Something of the troll to this movement, in a way, but a playfulness too. But it's isn't it funny that how quaint it seems 15 years on? That did it change poetry forever? And if it did,
I mean, I suppose it didn't in the sense that the technology just moved on, didn't it? I mean, I think FLARF had we kind of ended things there, possibly would have been something that we kind of remember. But, in thinking about FLARF, I suppose I sort of forget about it partly because it felt like a natural extension of, again, going back to Dada and then in the kind of postmodern phase of thinking about language poetry, which inherently is about play and about kind of thinking about, poetry and it is in terms of language that is set within a particular context, or how does language respond to different sorts of contextual juxtapositions. So in a sense, it's sort of like FLARF is sort of language poetry, the end of language poetry when it's put through a machine, effectively. So in a way, I guess we've kind of moved on. And maybe AI represents that. And AI-generated poetry is sort of, the next frontier.
Yes. Maybe we're waiting for that to leave its mark in a similar way. We had a laugh recently, didn't we, Sandeep, when there was reporting in the news about a senior researcher from the safety team at Anthropic who decided to quit, citing fears about the peril of AI and bioweapons. But in his resignation letter, he said that he was going to leave Silicon Valley and come to England to write poetry and become invisible. We said, oh yeah, that sounds about right.
It was that he was going to write poetry, but I think even more so, wasn't it that he was going to join a master's in creative writing program?
That will really do it.
Which is funny, thinking about, our previous discussion about work and the workshop model, what does it mean? Maybe he'll just turn out AI-driven workshop poems, great. Maybe that's fine. I don't know. AI can make good poems. Maybe it can make for bad poems. We shall see.
But there's a sense in which poetry and whatever AI generates are sort of set in opposition to one another, that poetry is like the highest expression of human uniqueness that will continue to flummox AI. So even Alan Turing quoted the neuroscientist Jeffrey Jefferson to the effect that poetry is like the sort of highest test, I guess, for an artificial intelligence, that not until a machine can write a sonnet or compose a concerto can we agree that machine equals brain.
Because poetry is somehow so much associated with the soul and the human soul and the expression of the human spirit. And I think in some ways this kind of takes us to that interesting thing that happens, perhaps. There are various sources for this, but this idea that poetry is itself a kind of machine. I think that the earliest instance that I saw of this was in Paul Valéry, in a lecture that he gave actually at Oxford in 1939. And he He writes that a poem is a kind of machine for producing the poetic state by means of words. And this machine's effect is uncertain in Valéry's thinking, but the result is a kind of a solution of problems. And then he goes on to say, if the expression machine shocks you, if my mechanized analogy seems crude, please note that while even a very short poem's composition may extend over a period of years, the poem's action on a reader is accomplished in just a few minutes. So this idea that actually the poet kind of can pour lots of time and lots of their soul or their emotions and the overflow of these emotions into the poem. But the poem itself actually is this little machine that just kind of creates this very dramatic effect. And it sort of takes energy, perhaps even from the poet, and emotion, and just kind of brings about this very efficient and very kind of quick, again, back to this idea of speed, effect on the reader.
Don Patterson says, doesn't he, that a poem is just a little machine for remembering itself. I think maybe he has Valéry in mind. I think he also had in mind Carlos William, a poem as a machine made of words. But this idea, yes, that poetry has this sort of technological aspect to it, that it's a technology for retaining information and for retransmitting it to other humans and down generations. But speaking of time, we should probably move on to our first poem, shouldn't we?
So the first poem we are going to look at is Time Bomb by Mina. And this poem is from 1946. The present moment is an explosion, a scission of past and future, leaving those valorous disreputables, the ruins, sentinels in an unknown dawn, strewn with prophecy. Only the momentary goggle of death fixes the fugitive momentum. The poem makes use of the space on the page, and there are caesuras sort of between each word, pretty much.
The words have been spaced out more than is usual, haven't they? There's sort of 10 presses of the space bar between each of these words rather than one.
Yeah. But not only the words are spaced out, but the punctuation, which is not frequent. There are about 4 pieces of punctuation here. There are 2 commas and 2 full stops. But they also have this space, this tab, this caesura between the words. So there's a kind of which is, of course, makes sense given that this is called Time Bomb. There is a kind of slow detonation here of syntax that we can see across the page. So it's a very kind of beautiful thing to look at, very unusual, and in fact unusual for Loy. This is, in fact, the only poem that I am aware of Loy's that uses this kind of spacing in this kind of regular fashion. She was a user and a lover of caesura, but this is unique.
The way those commas and the full stop hover severed from their words, it does feel like the whole thing is hanging in the air, ready to fall like debris in a way, doesn't it? 1946. So Loy is writing this, we presume, in the wake of the detonation of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 45.
Absolutely. That must have been on her mind. And she writes an essay in the 1940s that was unpublished during her lifetime, also on a similar subject called Tuning In on the Atom Bomb, where various things are happening in that essay, but it's sort of a critique of the Western use of force as, for her, something that was really antithetical to a kind of coherence of humanity and a coherence particularly of the self. But I'll say a bit about Loy, I think, generally just to introduce her as a poet, because she has a really fascinating relationship to technology, and this is something that comes to define, I think, her becoming a poet in many ways. But she was a British poet. She was born in London in 1882, which makes her an exact contemporary of Virginia Woolf. But this is very much where their paths diverge. She was a modernist poet. She was also an artist. She did some beautiful sketches, paintings, collages at the end of her life. She also made her own dresses, and she designed some extraordinarily beautiful and fragile lampshades, which she sold those lampshades, none of which survive, sadly, in a shop that was financially backed by Peggy Guggenheim in Paris in the 1920s. So she was a real maker of things. She brought that, I think, sensibility to her poetry as well. It was very much, I always feel like there's a kind of structural, architectural nature to her work. And again, some of that has to do with her use of space, but also the way she has a kind of concrete language in a lot of the work. But she had a very a kind of abrupt shift and towards being a poet, really by meeting Gertrude Stein, who she met in Florence at the beginning of the 20th century, while she was in a very bad marriage. And Stein really kind of, I think, gave her permission in some ways to make use of syntax and punctuation in a way that she hadn't perhaps thought of before. But also she encounters F.T. Marinetti, and I say encounter actually in a slightly euphemistic way. They had a relationship, they had an affair. She also had an affair with another Italian futurist, Giovanni Pepini, but Marinetti was kind of like a wake-up call for her. And so futurism drives a lot of her early poetry, and in fact she wrote aphorisms on futurism, which was published as a kind of, I mean, they are really aphorisms, but it's a kind of inspired by the Futurist Manifesto, which was published in 1914. And she says two things there, I think, that are really interesting maybe to think about in looking at Time Bomb. One is, today is the crisis in consciousness, and the other is die in the past, live in the future. So for Loy, futurism was an opportunity for her to break from the past, her own personal past, the very difficult life that she had growing up in London with her parents, who were kind of at war with each other all of the time. That seems to be very much evident in her autobiographical writings, but also a way for her to remake herself. And I think technology was a sort of, and futurism was a kind of leverage into thinking about what the poet could do in the future, how they could usher in the future. And she was a big believer in genius, and she wrote poems in defense of Joyce's Ulysses, and she was there when the kind of the censorship trials were happening. So she, I think in this poem is really thinking perhaps less about the actual atom bomb being dropped, but more maybe about the ways in which that form of really drastic technology would have made possible for the individual, but also for humanity, a kind of break with the past into this future that maybe isn't necessarily knowable, or maybe not necessarily even entirely bad, which is a strange thing to think about when we think about the atom bomb.
And yet, this poem is set in the ruins, isn't it? She returned, didn't she, to a bombed-out Europe, and hadn't written for many years before she wrote this poem. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a break. She's actually, at the time of writing this poem, she's left Paris and she's gone to the US at the behest of her children, who are very concerned that she's still in Paris. And Loy was half Jewish, and that would have contributed to their anxieties too. The break that occurs actually in the publication history that we have isn't so much that she's not writing, it's that she's actually writing prose. So she's really trying to write essays and find lots of ways. Again, she's very much a maker of things. She's sort of, she'll just take whatever is to hand and do what she can with it. She's someone who works with materials, and I think that the accounts of the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have been devastating, of course, to her and to her thinking. And she has another poem called Photo After Pogrom, which does, I think, speak to the horrors of that. But in this case, she's kind of thinking, perhaps, how might we consider this technology not as something that resulted in the deaths of lots and lots and lots of people, but how might we consider this technology literally of the nucleus or the atom being kind of split and releasing this harnessed energy as a metaphor for the individual psyche? Because she's really a spiritualist. She's an esoteric, eccentric thinker who is, Sarah Krangle, who is a brilliant Loy scholar, calls her a spiritualist magpie. She sort of thinks about she's done this 2-volume work on Loy recently, which is brilliant, as I say. But Loy has written this, tuning in on the atom bomb and then time bomb. And Krangle says that she's drawing on themes of combustibility and inclination, thinking about momentous fissures or divides as a way of regenerating and the cohering truths of the divine. Loy is so invested in the artist as a kind of visionary, as a kind of prophet. And so in this poem, the present moment that is exploding here is not the bomb, but it's the way in which the mind can actually just kind of break with the past.
That word scission, the present moment is an explosion, a scission of past and future. It does feel like there's a sort of echo there of fission, doesn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Scission, cutting, a dividing, including of molecules in chemistry. I think fission being something more specific in physics, the splitting of the atom, as we're saying. This idea of a dividing line between the past and the future. But it does feel like this poem is maybe also invoking philosophical discussions about the nature of the moment and the instant in time and the now, and how the present and time can be cut up into these ever smaller chunks of experience, and where do you put your finger on the now in that. I think there's an interesting relationship between momentary and momentum, isn't there? Momentum being another idea from physics, that I think the measuring what it takes to stop an object in motion. I had read a sort of pessimism in that momentum, that my goodness, we've unleashed this Pandora's box of this technology. Can we stop this juggernaut even if we wanted to? But I suppose your reading, Sandeep, reveals to me that maybe there's a more positive spin to that momentum also.
I think so. I mean, I think, and I sort of turn to the word fugitive here. So just to kind of recount that final stanza, only the momentary goggle of death fixes the fugitive momentum. I mean, I don't think we can see the goggle of death as being a necessarily good thing, but that's the only point at which we have a sort of physical body, in a sense, that is sort of witnessing the death, whether that's those on the ground who are sort of feeling or experiencing this mass death, or that's the goggle of us as sort of spectators on this particular moment. But fugitive, in my mind, recalls another great father of modernism in Charles Baudelaire's essay, The Painter of Modern Life, from 1863. He says, modernity is the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent, which makes up one half of art, the other being the eternal and the immutable. And that idea of the fugitive here is something that I think in the poem is both kind of moving, but also kind of static at the same time. So momentum here versus the momentary is the kind of fixed point, isn't it? But the momentum is movement that is constant, but not necessarily progressive. And I think that is maybe where the question of optimism comes in here. I don't think Loy is actually standing on the promontory and making a prophetic statement about whether or not anything is good. I think what she's saying here is we can take a moment in this this kind of tremendous leap, if you like, towards this death, or towards this kind of, this harnessing or releasing of energy, quite literally. But it is kind of movement, and it has its own speed, and it will probably carry on whether or not we like it. And I think that's maybe the sort of ambivalence that we read into the poem, which is difficult because in some ways one wants to see maybe something else in the poem, and where we see a sort of, I guess, a moment of judgment, or a sort of sense of the emotional core perhaps in the poem is in the valorous disreputables. I think this comes out of a sort of fascination with the saints, partly, that somehow, which she carries on to the end of her life, actually, that those who are on the margins of society, whether they be the prophets or the saints, or in she was very involved with kind of creating artwork out of the unhoused people who were in the Bowery in the Lower East Side, where she was living towards the end of her life before she was swept away to Colorado. But this idea that somehow the marginal figure of the genius or of the saint is there in that disreputable kind of line is maybe where she feels like the possibility or the hope is coming from, even if they are standing amidst ruins, even if they are the sentinels of something that is unknown. That's the kind of space that the artist occupies, is not there really to pass judgment, but to witness and to think about the possibilities.
This unknown dawn strewn with prophecy, as if it were trash or rubble. I found myself thinking about the various other poets who have written about nuclear bombs and atomic technologies, and the difference between their readings of this moment and Loy's. William Carlos Williams wrote about the atomic bomb as well, didn't he? But perhaps the best known poem on this subject is William Stafford's At the Bomb Testing Site. Stafford, another American, writing in 1953. But Stafford, rather than taking us to the aftermath, the ruins, he's thinking about the moment of anticipation before the bomb goes off, and he zooms in on this little lizard at noon in the desert, a panting lizard waiting for history, its elbows tense. It was looking at something farther off than people could see, at the flute end of consequences. I do love that image, the flute end of consequences. And I spent some time unpacking it in my mind. It's actually more mysterious than I initially thought. I suppose it's you blow into a flute and then the sound that emerges is further down the line at the end of the pipe and the instrument. But I suppose it also makes me picture something fluted, that the consequences spread and get ramify in ways you can't anticipate.
And the poet as someone who is blowing the flute, I guess, in a sense that the poem becomes the voice, the song here as well. But I'm interested, I suppose, in the way that Stafford is also painting the lizard, the panting lizard, and the lizard who is waiting. And in a way, it's impossible not to think about this particular form of technology and to not feel that one is really on the outside and one is in that moment of anticipation or seeing the aftermath, because, of course, one can't be on the inside. And maybe there is an ethical dimension to that as well, that the world was just kind of helplessly watching these things happening. And the fear then of that recurring through the Cold War was again a kind of panting and waiting and watching, wasn't it? But very differently, Gertrude Stein, back to Stein, must be sort of satirical in some way, but writes something very brief, which was published, I think, 1947, but written in 1946, called Reflection on the Atom Bomb. And it's a very sort of Steinian text, which is obviously kind of repetitive in Stein's and without punctuation and the syntax that we've come to associate with Stein. But it begins by her writing, "They asked me what I thought of the atomic bomb. I said I had not been able to take any interest in it." And I can't imagine that that is true, but there is a kind of interesting flex, if you like, in sort of saying, you know, the biggest, most dramatic form of technology and the most disastrous outcome of war, which has huge consequences for the world, is something that I felt was not really something that interested me. It's quite strange.
Maybe we feel the same about AI.
Maybe we're just a bit ambivalent about AI. But the other thing that comes to mind with poetry and the atom bomb is William Carlos Williams. Again, we're not in his poetry where he thinks about the atom bomb, but actually in a comment that he makes about the wasteland. And he says in his autobiography, which was published, I think it's 1951, he writes, reflecting on the publication of The Wasteland by Eliot, that the poem wiped out our world as if an atom bomb had been dropped upon it, and our brave sallies into the unknown were turned to dust. It's really as though Eliot has kind of come and really spoiled the fun. And it's not so much that the atom bomb here in Williams's thinking has kind of destroyed poetry as it was. It's actually, interestingly, that for Williams, the wasteland destroyed what poetry could have been. So it's sort of like, Williams is sort of like, we're making this great progress. You know, we'd invented this new language and this locality of the American, kind of speech. And Eliot took us back to the classroom, he writes. It was, I think he describes it as a sardonic bullet that ended our hilarity. I mean, it's really quite funny. I mean, Williams's autobiography is just full of brilliant observations like this. But the atom bomb here is actually technology that takes us back into the past. And I think that's fascinating because up till now, it's really been an anxiety about a future. But in the case of Williams, it's going back to the ruins. It's creating ruins that are the ruins of the past that one, I guess, shores against one's ruins,
Thinking about past, future, Hannah Sullivan, who I mentioned earlier with her scholarly hat on, her long poem, Repeat Until Time, ends by imaginatively recreating the scene in the lead up to the detonation of Gadget, the world's first atomic bomb at the Trinity testing site for the Manhattan Project in July 1945, and calls it the world's first countdown. So we are transported to the humans waiting, a bit like that desert lizard panting on the sand. July 16, 1945, lightning zigzags, delays. It is minus 20 minutes, minus 19. It is the world's first countdown. And if only time could dilate, or speed up, it would be never, or it would be game over. I never realized seconds could be so long. And that quote is James B. Conant, the Harvard University president, who was an official on the Manhattan Project, waiting for the explosion and thinking what would happen if the countdown hit zero and nothing did happen. A bit of poetry trivia. It seems that Oppenheimer named the test site Trinity after his favourite poet, John Donne. And his poem, Batter My Heart, Three-Personed God.
Okay.
But this sense that technology is something that could dilate or speed up time and makes us think about time. Sullivan continues, now nothing will ever be the same again and everything will be as it always was. That's a sensation, I think, that sort of runs through all of the poems we're going to look at today.
If you're enjoying this episode, then why not try the LRB's Close Readings podcast, which covers literature from ancient Greece to the present day and features several series on poetry with Seamus Perry and Mark Ford. Listeners can get 25% off a 12-month subscription. You just need to use the code POETRY25, that's POETRY25, at checkout, and you can find a link in the description of this episode.
And our next poem is by Lavinia Greenlaw, isn't it?
Yes.
This is the title poem from Lavinia Greenlaw's A World Where News Travelled Slowly, published by Faber in 1997. The poem also won the Forward Prize for Best Single Poem. So it did seem to catch in its historical moment. I guess looking back from 2026, maybe 1997 feels like a world where news travelled slowly. And that title, it seems, came from the name of an exhibit about telecommunications and clattering telegraphs at the Science Museum, where Greenlaw was a writer in residence in 96, the Science Museum in London, that is.
It could take from Monday to Thursday and 3 horses. The ink was unstable, the characters cramped, the paper tore where it creased. Stained with the leather and sweat of its journey, the envelope absorbed each climatic shift, as well as the salt and grease of the rider, who handed it over with a 4-day chance that by now things were different, and while the head had to listen, the heart could wait. Semaphore was invented at a time of revolution, the judgment of swing in a vertical arm. News travelled letter by letter along a chain of towers, each built within telescopic distance of the next. The clattering mechanics of the 6-shutter telegraph still took 3 men with all their variables added to those of light and weather to read, record, and pass the message on. Now words are faster, smaller, harder. We're almost talking in one another's arms. Coded and squeezed, what chance has my voice to reach your voice unaltered and to leave no trace? Nets tighten across the sky and the seabed. When London made contact with New York, there were such fireworks City Hall caught light. It could have burned to the ground.
I suppose there's probably quite a lot of history here.
A sort of potted history of evolving modes of communication over a few centuries.
Yes. And I confess I don't really know how these things work, how the telegraph. I mean, I sort of vaguely know, but it was interesting that the poem opens up this history because it is a kind of long-winded process of getting the news across the Atlantic, which is no great surprise.
Well, and I guess the riders wouldn't have made it over the Atlantic. The post relay would have been doing well.
No, that's true. So it's true. We have different forms of technology. One of which is clearly not technology, which is the horse rider. But
well, yes, I had to do some sleuthing on this because the semaphore seems created in a time of revolution. That's a different thing to the telegraph, of course, isn't it? So
okay.
it's a sort of precursor technology.
Oh, yes.
And so we're morphing from one technology that involves shutters and flags potentially and swinging arms to something electronic or electric at least, passing information along wires in the deep sea bed.
Right, because a cable was laid. Transatlantic telegraph cables were laid by 1858. And those wires, which just sounds like an extraordinary undertaking, almost hard to believe, did revolutionize global communication. And then, of course, made way for other forms. But the poem does make that kind of leap between old forms of technology, which are, again, probably not technology, which is, of course, the horse and rider. And then this semaphore, which is basically waving arms, to the actual telegraph, which is significant in the way, I suppose, that speed, we think about speed, but also the ways in which the human engages.
Yes, and the body, I suppose, that there's a movement from something incredibly material and embodied with the leather and sweat and the salt and grease of those riders and the paper that tears and the ink that's unstable through the clattering of the terrestrial semaphore telegraph and those shutters and the variables of light and weather that mean that the men housed in their towers with their spyglasses watching for the signal from the next tower along, will they be able to see or will mist get in the way? The distance is increasing and there's still contingency and human agency and error involved, but it's also a business of light and weather, onto the telegraph cables and then the fibre optics or signals whizzing through the sky of modern telecommunications.
Yeah, and the idea, I guess, of news too. And of course, we have, harkening back to Ezra Pound saying that literature is news that stays news. It's interesting to think about what this news is in the poem and how that news can be differently felt. Because the poem is in 3 stanzas, and each of these types of relays of news, whether they're on rider on horseback or the semaphore or the telegraph, is in each of those stanzas. But is there a kind of sense that the news is really what's important here? Or is it really just the idea of the speed and the human element in the poem?
I think it's quite interesting, the psychology that's developed in the last 3 lines of that first stanza. The psychology of that weight, I suppose, for the news, and the uncertainty that exists in the delay, and the rider who handed it over with a 4-day chance that by now things were different, and while the head had to listen, the heart could wait.
Yes.
So yes, I mean that it's not specified what the news is, but it seems to be something of moment in either direction. I don't know, the results of a battle or the turning point in a loved one's disease, and that wishful thinking might permit one to retain the illusion that things aren't going bad for longer in that 4 days.
It is somewhat devastating how fast news travels. I think we can feel that very keenly nowadays, for sure. But this poem, actually, when I was thinking about, or we were sort of discussing where it kind of came from in some ways, and of course we know that, as you said earlier, it comes from a residency that Greenlaw had at the Science Museum. But there's a poem by Robert Browning, who is writing, of course, in the 19th century, and the poem is How They Brought the Good News from Ghent to Aix, which in some ways it feels like this poem might be in a kind of dialogue with, either kind of knowingly or unknowingly. But and I suppose partly that's the idea of news, but also the fascination with, in Browning's case at least, of the poem, with the ways in which the human element of it is really at the forefront, but in a relationship with the horse. So this poem by Browning is all about these 3 riders who leave Ghent, and they get on their horses. In fact, the poem begins, I sprang to the stirrup, and Joris and he, I galloped, Dirk galloped, we galloped all 3. Good speed, cried the watch as the gate bolts undrew. Speed, echoed the wall to us galloping through. Behind shut the postern, the lights sank to rest, and into the midnight we galloped abreast. There's something sort of, wonderfully kind of the momentum, the rhyme and everything else is, it feels like you're on the horse, but over the course of the poem, what happens is that 2 of the horses and riders basically kind of fall. Possibly the horses die. And it's just this last horse, Roland, who makes it with his rider. And they kind of, over the course of getting finally to Aix to deliver whatever this news is of Aix's fate, I think as Browning puts it, the horse and the man sort of become one. And this is hilarious. At the end of the poem, by the end of the poem, they're giving the horse wine, if I'd read that correctly. It's like, yay, well done, Roland. But the connection between the animal and the man, the thinking about distance, the thinking about how news travels, is, of course, kind of being engaged with here in the first stanza of Greenlaw's poem, where we have 3 horses too, but in a different sort of way, I guess. This is a kind of relay, isn't it, really?
Well, and also, I think it might be there in an echo of the triple rhythm in that line, as well as the salt and the grease of the rider, as the gallop of the triple feet there, as with Browning. But this poem of Browning's is remarkable for another reason, isn't it?
Yes. Well, it is the first example of a poet's voice that is recorded. So this Robert Browning was recorded by on an kind of Edison wax cylinder shortly before his death in 1889, and he decides to read this poem, or at least tries to, because
you can listen back to it, can't you? It's remarkably fuzzy. The surviving clip.
Right. Well, I mean, I suppose 19th century poets memorize their poems. But in this case, poor Browning is so taken aback by technology.
He forgets his own poem, doesn't he?
He forgets his own poem. And he sort of says, that this is because it's just so overwhelming, really, listening to, or being kind of in front of this form of technology.
And we can actually listen to that recording of Browning's.
Jorie, I gallop, red gallop, he galloped all 3. Please, I go to gold, red gallop is true. Seems a look is happening. Let the gate back behind us. The light sets the gate. I'm extremely sorry that I can't remember the own person. But one thing that I shall remember all my life is the vanity that was this big reduced something about your wonderful invention. Robert Browning. Bravo, bravo, bravo. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hammer!
It's quite hard to make out amid all the fuzz and static, but what Browning's saying there is, I'm terribly sorry, but I can't remember my own verses.
He kind of then at that point tries to recite another poem, but then begins to just sort of cheer, doesn't he?
This is Robert Browning. Hip hip hooray!
And other people are kind of hipping and hurraying as well in the background. So that's an example, I guess, of where Browning's voice is, is kind of eaten up by technology.
But also the sheer delight at that wax cylinder and what it represents, and the amazingness, I presume, of hearing his voice and his poem back for the first time ever.
Yeah. His voice is now news from a very distant past. And of course, he was very quickly overtaken by Tennyson, who didn't forget his lines, which comes as no surprise, I'm sure, to anyone.
But Greenlaw is interested in her poem in the imprint of human presence and the trace of it, particularly in the voice in that last stanza. So we were trying to think our way back to 1997 and what mode of telephonic communication Greenlaw is actually describing here. I think it's somewhat ambiguous whether it is a phone conversation, whether on a landline or a mobile at this point, or if it is a text message. Now words are faster, smaller, harder. We're almost talking in one another's arms. That's in italics. That would seem to be the interlocutor speaking from some distance, possibly transatlantic, possibly not. Coded and squeezed. What chance has my voice to reach your voice unaltered and to leave no trace? It's interesting that to leave no trace. It's almost counterintuitive, isn't it?
I mean, it's quite sad, and I think that it speaks to, again, the way in which technology brings us closer, but also further apart, or gives us the impression, at least, of being closer. And that, I suppose, is there that the trace of a voice. What does that really mean to the poem? What does that mean? What does the trace here represent? Is it somehow a retention of the human in the technological? Or is the trace there always going to be failing the idea or failing kind of what the human element there, what the intimacy is that's there? I suppose it could be any way in which computer code or coded language tries to retain that human element, but then will always fail. And at the very end of the poem, when London made contact with New York, there was such fireworks. City Hall caught light. It could have burned to the ground. Actually did happen.
To be a reference to an actual historical event, doesn't it? That it seems that the very first message sent across the telegraph was from the US directors of the company to the ones in Britain. How does it go? Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill towards men is part of the message they sent. Yeah. Europe and America are united by telegraph.
That's our special relationship.
Yes. And the next day, Queen Victoria sent a message in the other direction to President James Buchanan, didn't she?
Yeah.
And it seems that message of 98 words took 16 hours to send. Wow. But it was greeted by this huge burst of excitement on the other side, wasn't it? So they had a grand salute of 100 guns in New York, and flags were hung up and bells were rung in the churches. And on the 1st of September, there was a parade and an evening torchlight procession and a fireworks display.
What could go wrong?
That set City Hall on the town hall on fire.
Yeah.
But I think it is also a Promethean fire, this fire, isn't it, at the end of the poem? It's the sort of spark of human innovation and progress stolen from the gods.
For which one is punished.
For which one is punished
Yes.
and that might lead to unknown conflagrations.
Back to the flute end of consequences.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess there's maybe a play on electricity and that spark too, that we were, back in the day, creatures of salt and grease, and now we are electric signals travelling along fibre optics. From a world where news travelled slowly to one where information speeds forth exponentially, let's move on now to our final poem we'll look at today, which is also our poem from the LRB archive. This poem is by the American poet Jorie and is called Honeycomb. It first appeared in the LRB in 2014 and was later published in Fast in 2017, Graham's 12th collection of poems. It's a book that deals with the sense of, as Graham put it in an interview, uncontrollable acceleration into some kind of end time. So we've already had the atom bomb's end of time scenario to Graham's anxieties about end of time climate change or technological singularity. Honeycomb. Ode to Prism, aria, untitled, wait, I wait. Have you found me yet? Here at my screen, can you make me out? Make me out. All other exits have been sealed. See me, or we will both vanish. We need emblematic subjectivities, need targeted acquiescence, time zones. This is the order of the day. To be visited secretly, to be circled and cancelled. I cover my face. Total war. Why am I still so invisible to you? No passport needed. If you look in, the mirror chokes you off. No exit, try again. Build bonfire, light up screen. What are you eating there? Can you survive on light? What is your theory of transmission? The centre holds, it holds, don't worry about that. These talkings here are not truths, they are needs. They are purchases and invoices. They are not what shattered the silence. Not revolutions, clocks, navigational tools. Have beginnings and ends. Therefore not true, have sign-offs. I set out again now with a new missive. Feel this, my broken seduction. My tiny visit to the other, busy, temporary. In the screen there is sea. Your fibre optic cables line its floor. Entire, ghost juice. The sea now does not emit sound. It carries eternity as information, all its long floor. Clothed as I am, in circumstance. See cell depth, sound its atom. You need to look in to hear further past the grains of light, the remains of the ships, starlight. What cannot go or come back. What has mass and does not traverse distance is all here. Look here. Near the screen there are roses. Outside a new day moon. Can you see my room? Inside my room, inside me where there is room for what I miss, I am missing all of it. It is invisible to me. It is invisible to you. You have the names of my friends, my markers, my markets, my late-night queries. RE chemo, RE the travel pass, RE where to send the photo, the side effects, the distinguishing features. Bot says, hide. Where? Bot does not know. Bot knows. What is it to know here? Can you hear the steps approaching? I hold my breath here. Can you hear that? Bot must also hold its breath. Now the steps continue past. We can breathe freely once again in this hiding place. The visible world, among shapes and spoken words, in here with my traces. Can you please track me? I do not feel safe. Find the flesh nearest to my flesh. Find the nearest rain, also passion. Surveil this void, the smell of these stalks and the moisture they are drawing up in order not to die too fast. The die is cast. The smell of geography is here. What is the smell of chain, invisible chain? The stone on my desk I brought back from Crete. The milk I did not finish in this cup. There is smoke from the debris my neighbour burns. Don't forget to log in my exile. This one. Female. MRN 3912412. I offer myself up for you to see. Can you not see? Why do you only see these deeds? There is a page on my desk in which first love is taking place. There is a page on my desk in which first love is taking place again. Neither of the characters yet knows they are in love. A few inches from there, Mrs. Ramsay speaks again. She always speaks, and Lily Briscoe moves the salt. The sky passes by rounding us. The houses have their occupants. Some have women locked in deep. See them. Someone has left them in the dark. He stands next to the fridge and drinks his beer. He turns the volume up so no one hears. That is the Republic. Are you surveilling? We would not want you to miss the women kicked in order to abort the rape. Those screams. Make sure you bank them, you will need them, to prove who you were when they ask. I am eating. Can you taste this? It is nut butter and a mockingbird just cut short a song to fly. I tap this screen with my fork. I dream a little dream in which the fork is king. A fly lands on the screen because it is summer afternoon. Locusts start up. The river here, are you keeping track? I know you can see the purchases, but who is purchasing me? Can you please track that? I want to know how much I am worth. River pebbles, how many, count them, exact number, and the bee that did return to the hive today, those which did not lose their way, and exactly what neural path the neurotoxin took. Please track disorientation, count death, each death, very small, see it from there, count and store. I am the temporary, but there is also the permanent. Have you looked to it for now?
It's such an extraordinary poem, isn't it? Really, and the momentum, I guess. Going back to that, there's so much energy in the poem. It's almost like the nucleus.
Building up a speed to carry freight. This is a fascinating poem, and I feel like it's even more revealing for me, even though I know it well, after reading it next to the Greenlaw poem, actually. The coincidence of the fibre optics and the deep sea cables, and the idea of revolutions of various sorts, political change and technological change too. These talkings here are not truths, not revolutions, clocks, navigational tools. Graham seems to be thinking about technology as a sort of watershed in human history, but maybe also a wrong turn. Like, are there these points in the past where humanity could have taken a different path, I think is part of what she's wondering in this poem. It might seem almost unpassably dense on a first listening, this poem. But the interesting thing about it is that it does resolve into a sort of scene and situation once you start picking up the little clues, that as well as it being a sort of wafting drift of luminous consciousness flitting between different coordinates and vectors, it is also a scene where we seem to be able to recognise a woman sat at her desk. She's in front of her computer screen. That untitled might be a poem that doesn't have a title yet, but it also might be a Word doc just opened and not yet saved. She has a glass of milk that she hasn't finished drinking yet on her desk, and also a copy of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf.
Yes, which I suppose stands in here for lots of things, but the pointing back to modernism is, of course, quite meaningful too, but specifically with the question of consciousness, the stream of consciousness narration in something like To the Lighthouse, but the way that the novel shapes time as, just by its very structure, of the past and of the kind of future by the section time passes in the center there. So we know that we're in the terrain, I guess, in Graham's poem here, of thinking about the relationship again between kind of time and technology, and how technology separates us from our past and our future. I'm interested in the kind of address in the poem as well. And I wonder what you make of all of the kind of the yous in the poem.
On the one hand, we seem to be dealing with a prismatically divided self. Ode to Prism, the poem begins. It's an ode and an aria to a prismatic self. There are other poems in Fast, this collection, that speak in the voices of bots or of the deep sea bed. It's a book that's very interested in expanding the sort of lyric consciousness away from a unitary human coherent I and sort of letting these fields of other than human in. But of course, that you, which is possibly shifting through the course of the poem, seems key to its effect, doesn't it? At some points you wonder if it's the you that this woman is communicating with online. There's traces here and there of what feel like a Skype call. This is 2014, so we haven't yet met a world where Zoom and Teams calls are commonplace.
Yes.
Or possibly chatting by email or messenger on the computer with a human interlocutor. But it also seems to be a bot that she's speaking to, or possibly the surveilling algorithmic, whatever, it probably wrong to call that an intelligence, but she's addressing the whatever computational devices are reading her as she's reading the internet. This is a poem written in the wake of the Snowden revelations about global surveillance, and it seems very sensitized to that idea of being watched, as we saw in Nasser Hussein's poem towards the start, didn't we? But it does mean that this idea of the screen makes you think of Baudrillard and simulacra, maybe, in this refracted self of light. It's also a screen in the sense of wanting privacy, maybe. The MRN number, a medical record number, that is, isn't she? The poet is undergoing chemotherapy for her, I think, second cancer in the course of writing this book. And so it might be a screen in a doctor's office as well.
Which I guess changes our relationship to the mention of kind of cells and atoms and the thinking through of just the human on a cellular level potentially as well, but also the mention of chemotherapy. I mean, I guess the question there about the form of address, or the way in which, I think you rightly said that the you is kind of multiple and changing. The I also seems to be kind of multiple and changing, or at least the I is kind of being brought into question, kind of what constitutes the self. And this goes back to privacy. This goes back to the medical record number. Who am I? Am I my medical record number? Well, certainly, I think if you're, undergoing a kind of hospital stay or a continuous treatment, you do become the information that is stored, whether it's actually in a file or if it's kind of online under this particular unique identifying number, which we all seem to have in various forms in our existences. But I suppose it's worth kind of also just going back to thinking about what traditionally happens in the kind of lyric poem, where the premise is with an I, that it is the speaker who is a kind of form of the poet, right? And I think that that expectation does exist here. We sort of move away from that once we begin to realize that the I, where is it here? The sort of I am, why am I still so invisible to you? And then later on, the kind of the I is missing all of it, is invisible, and the kind of just the ways in which the I comes to be known through its market preferences, whatever information is being gleaned from the I without its permission. But then there's also the you, who is this sort of traditionally, again, this, the kind of often the lover who is addressed in the poem, in that kind of very typical, maybe lyric construction. The addressee is sometimes a person in the poem, but sometimes also the listener, the reader.
Yes. The reader or listener is sort of configured as an overhearer, or might at points be directly addressed, as with that line you quoted about can I be known? Am I known? Being seen, panopticon style, but not necessarily known, is one theme, an idea in this poem.
How sinister then to have the overhearer in the sort of typical poem be someone who is actually just taking information and trying to, through this technology or these technologies, to store it rather than to listen and to learn something potentially from this evocation of speech, which is the lyric poem, is kind of interesting, particularly with Snowden. And that's a really fascinating way of thinking about the poem. But I'm interested too in this honeycomb of the title and the bees. What's sort of going on there?
Well, that seems to be coming from Wolf and To the Lighthouse, doesn't it? I think the motif of bees, or perhaps more particularly hives, comes up a few times in To the Lighthouse, but most especially when Lily Briscoe is wondering about what humans can know of one another. And this is the image that she turns to. Probably easiest to just read a passage. And yet she knew knowledge and wisdom was stored up in Mrs. Ramsay's heart. How then, she had asked herself, did one know one thing or another thing about people, sealed as they were? Only like a bee, drawn by some sweetness or sharpness in the air, intangible to touch or taste, one haunted the dome-shaped hive, ranged the wastes of the air over the countries of the world alone, and then haunted the hives with their murmurs and their stirrings, the hives which were people.
So the hive becomes a metaphor for intimacy.
Yes, that I suppose the walls of the honeycomb cellular structure are both what connect and divide the people in this metaphor, I suppose. We also get the bees and the flitting, returning bees recurring at the very end of Graham's poem, where they're hovering somewhere between metaphor and reality. There's something seems to be going awry, though, that only some of the bees are making it back to the hive. Some of them seem to be disorientated, possibly by a neurotoxin or a pesticide.
I think
there's,
about that.
there's some sort of sense of disorder, if not quite colony collapse, then maybe there's a poisoning happening. And this is Graham's ecological consciousness coming through. But this is also a book that's much preoccupied with the decline of her parents. There are several moving elegies for her father whose death she anatomizes with amazing and terrifying scrutiny, but also the dementia and decline of her mother. And I sort of feel that echoed in the mortality and the derangement of these bees. And actually, it's striking, isn't it? This sense of the mortality, the bodily fragility of humans. Even the bot breathes and must hold its breath. Isn't that amazing, that section? Bot says hide. Where? Bot does not know. Bot knows. What is it to know here? Can you hear the steps approaching? That's echoing the wolf, isn't it? I hold my breath here. Can you hear that? Bot must also hold its breath.
It's almost kind of cute, this bot.
Yeah.
It feels like a pet, an imaginary friend.
I mean, we were trying to remember what bots and chat bots and Twitter bots actually looked like back in 2014. Certainly not what they have become now.
No, now they're quite helpful.
Yeah, well, sycophantic. But a bot must also hold its breath. They're underwater. This poem configures the sea as this sort of unconscious archive, a repository of information, doesn't it? Graham wrote an earlier book, Sea Change, which thought about the transformations of the Tempest and the death of Ferdinand's father, death of her father again. But the fact that the bot must hold its breath, I think this is a poem that's invested in the notion that even with all the spectrality of the screens and the diffused self, there is some core of human embodied experience that comes to the fore when the body is in crisis, as it is during cancer treatment. And that the AIs and bots will perhaps never be able to write poems, I think Graham would argue, until they can experience that sort of bodily pain and fragility. Yeah. And there's that rather shocking moment, isn't there, of the women kicked in order to abort the rape, those screams, which haunts the poem and changes everything around it. Is that something encountered in the news feed, do you think?
It moves so quickly, doesn't it? But you're right, to that moment, because suddenly we go from Lily Briscoe moving the salt, who is this sort of artist figure in Woolf's novel, who kind of, I think in the end, just sort of compromises, really, and just sort of the best she can to represent something that no longer exists, to a man who is standing next to a fridge drinking beer. And then, as you say, the women that are kicked in order to abort the rape. It must be news. And I guess this, goes back to when news does not travel slowly, but actually where it interferes and intercedes into the present moment, having started this section of the poem thinking about love. And love doesn't come here. Love becomes something else, which is eventually possibly colony collapse, with the bees there. But there isn't much love. There is a kind of unknowable I. The I know is there quite frequently, really, in this section. But also that line, which I find really fascinating, which is that to prove who you were when they asked. There's something very sinister about the they there, as we have with the line about the women who are kicked. That this is actually feels like a very specific kind of violence that is done to those who are disempowered by forms of technology, who are actually maybe victims to it, who are being surveilled, whose bodies are no longer their own and under their own control. And that is potentially why we have that here en route to where the poem ends, which is, I am the temporary, but there is also the permanent. I wonder what the temporary and permanent are doing here.
Have you looked to it for now? And Graham is fascinated by that now. It's a word that rings through her poems, actually, across many, many books. We began with Loy and the present moment and its passing into slivers of experience. And I think that is also where Graham is leaving us here. It's interesting, the layout of this poem, isn't it? It's in 3 sections, a long prosy line, but it isn't prose. There are line breaks, aren't there? Including that rather wonderful one in the first line, here at my screen, can you make me, line break, out? Make me out. And we talked about edges and precipices. I think that, and you also taught Sandeep about the long line and the screen. And that as a sort of measure or prolongation of attention. I think Graham's thinking about attention spans and their famous shortening, and maybe the moral obligation of the poet to try to expand that unit again. But each line break here does feel like a sort of fall or maybe a leap. But also across the 3 sections of the poem, the first and the last sections are single-spaced, while the middle section, which is where the bot comes in and the MRN is suddenly double-spaced. And it does seem to enforce a change of pace, doesn't it?
It does.
Among other things.
It does. It also makes me think of the sort of conventions, really, of having to choose between single and double spacing and how in certain contexts one chooses single and one chooses double. And I feel like in the context of poetry, we tend to choose single spacing, whereas if we're writing prose, for whatever, we kind of have to do double spacing. Right. And I suppose it's that thing of like just the eye being able to follow. And with poetry, we don't worry about it so much, but with prose, it's like the mind can't get its head around prose and single spacing. If you turn in an essay in single space prose, you will get across the top of it your tutor writing, use double spacing and 12-point font. But I guess sort of like the light coming from a prism or an aria, there is an overflowing in this first and final section. Which has a different rhythm, though. And I think that is very visible and interesting maybe in thinking about this transition from technologies, sort of like with the Greenlaw poem where we start with the horse rider and we go to the cables. But in the first kind of, by and large, in the first stanza, we have these almost like telegraphically short sentences and the use of the end stop. And just the way in which the telegraph or the telegram, I guess, in this case, required this kind of brevity of language. But then towards the end of that stanza, we have moving into a really fascinating element of punctuation, which is this dash line that has a little arrow on the end. It's like a little vector.
Yes, I think Graham explained that she came across that almost by accident in an interview, didn't she? That she pressed the hyphen key followed by the greater than symbol, and they sort of whooshed together in an arrow. Actually, Fiona Green, reviewing Graham's most recent collection in the LRB a few months ago, late last year, said she found these arrows a bit on the nose, I think. That she
It's a nice way of
can
putting
see
it.
what you're doing there, Jorie.
Yeah.
But they are unusual. It sort of takes the Dickinsonian dash and gives it a directionality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And a speed. It reminds me of, I don't know, logic diagrams, flowcharts.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Mind maps.
Yeah, because you kind of can't go backwards. Whereas with the dash line, I mean, even with Dickinson, which sort of, I guess there is some debate as to whether it creates speed or if it creates a kind of a different sort of pause, but you can go back and forth. It flows two ways, whereas here it's very much kind of progress, whether that's positive or negative.
Only onwards.
Only onwards, yeah, absolutely. Only over the edge, over the precipice. And I guess that does take us back to the sort of question of speed, but also it's an improvement on the modernists too, who also took up the dash line. And Woolf, I guess to an extent, thinks about this and just the sort of the movement of language and the movement of consciousness and how consciousness keeps pace. But when you introduce another form of consciousness, which is this bot, or potentially the kind of surveilling listener, the algorithm that's watching your preferences and making judgments about you, maybe that stream of consciousness requires arrows. Maybe this is the machine consciousness.
For some reason, makes me think of the way that the word breaking resounds, not I think in this poem, but across Fast, the collection as a whole. It also makes me think of Mark Zuckerberg saying that tech needs to move fast and break things. That motto of his.
Such a futurist thing to say.
All the brokenness of the syntax and the reconnecting of those fragments that happens in this poem. It is thinking about the idea of brokenness in our world, but also breaking news, breaking with an A rather than an EA. Can we slow this down? Can we put the brakes on as we accelerate over the edge into the too late?
I mean, I guess that takes us back to the question we asked of the Loy poem, really, is do we think that Jorie Graham is kind of interested in consequences or concerned about the consequences of this technology, or, the technologies that she's engaging with? I mean, how do you think she wants us to feel?
I think that this is one of the most fascinating and engaged and, to me, realistic accounts I've seen of how it feels to be a consciousness in a physical and digital world simultaneously. And I think that Graham is frightened about the consequences of that. And maybe the little scream from the newsfeed of the horror of the women being kicked to abort the rape, that is thinking about the consequences of encountering such images in passing on a open window, and what implications that has for our sense of ourselves as moral agents and actors. We talked about spectatorship and the sentinels and the watching but not intervening that happens in Loy's poem, and I think that that's also active here.
What we've come to really over the course of looking at these three poems is that poets are and have been always fascinated by technological change, also terrified, I think, by it, and have made use of it in various forms too. And the question, I guess, that we ask ourselves now is what will happen next? Are we on the cusp of a new wave of poetic innovation driven by this encounter between kind of the poetic imagination and potentially artificial intelligence? Are we all doomed? Yeah, well, next time we will be looking at a very different subject, which is poetry and divorce. And in thinking about poetry and divorce, we will look at a poem from the LRB archive. Again, this time by the German poet Hans Magnus Enzensberger.
If you've enjoyed our conversation about poetry today, perhaps you'd consider subscribing to the Close Readings podcast. Mark Ford and Seamus Perry have various wonderful series on poetry there that you might enjoy. And listeners can get 25% off by using the code Poetry25. You'll find a link in the description.